The Scariest Things Police Have Seen, Episode 51. This story was sent to me on Instagram by the son of a police officer in the Manchester Police Force. There is a 300-year-old abandoned mansion that is still fitted with an alarm system to keep out intruders. One night the alarm went off and this officer met up with the K9 unit in front of the house. The dog was described as being very tough and not scared of a thing, but it refused to go near the house. The officers searched the entire inside and found nothing but dead crows and dead rats. After the house was clear, they went outside to check on the dog. It was whining and staring up at the house. The officers followed the dog's line of sight and saw it was looking at an attic window. Inside the window, the officers could see a man wearing Victorian-era clothing staring back at them. For a moment, they stared at each other until the man took a step backwards and out of sight. The officer rushed back inside, looking for the man. Again, no one was found. The Scariest Things Police Have Seen, Episode 52. This story is from a correctional officer at a prison in Pendleton, Oregon. At about 2 a.m. on a graveyard shift, an officer was alone at his desk. He looked up to observe the dark cell block and saw an inmate standing in the middle of the room. The officer told the man to get back inside the cell. He refused and didn't move. The officer radioed for a sergeant to assist him. The sergeant arrived and also ordered the man to return to the cell, but he continued to refuse. The sergeant began to approach the inmate with his pepper spray drawn. The sergeant told the officer to turn on the lights. He got closer and closer to the inmate. As soon as the lights turned on, the inmate disappeared. There was no one there, but they had both seen a figure. You see, this prison has a lot of history. It used to be a state mental hospital. When it was converted to a prison, there were 100 unmarked jars of cremated remains found in tunnels underneath. The Scariest Things Police Have Seen, Episode 53. This is a story that made international news in Scotland in 2016. Police officers were called to a residence by a homeowner. The house was occupied by a woman and her young son. She was in fear because objects around the house had been moving on their own. Police officers originally thought this was going to be a mental health issue, but they were wrong. They arrived and spoke with the homeowner about what was happening. During that initial conversation, one officer heard a noise coming from the kitchen and went to investigate. As she walked in, the oven door slammed shut with no one around it. After that, a kitchen towel flew past her head like someone had thrown it. They called for a supervisor who arrived at the house. He walked in and observed the sofa and lampshades moving on their own. The family's chihuahua randomly appeared on a 7-foot hedge. Police determined there was nothing they could do to help the family, so a priest was called to bless the house. You can read more about this online. Scariest Things Police Have Seen, Episode 54. Imagine being alone and having this encounter. An abandoned apartment complex in California was known for being a high-crime area. The apartment was cleared and scheduled for demolition. The sender of this story, a security officer, was assigned to guard the complex at night. One night he patrolled the outside of the complex. Suddenly, he heard a scream coming from inside. He saw a light on in a window of the 3rd floor. He looked closer and saw a woman standing in the window looking at him. He went up to investigate and saw it was apartment number 329. He yelled to whoever was inside the apartment to come out, but no one answered. He went inside, but found no one there. The light was still on, and he looked at the window where he saw the woman. He noticed something odd. There was what appeared to be a blood stain underneath the window. Just then the light turned off and the door slammed shut. He ran outside the apartment and found no one there. He did some research and found out a woman was brutally murdered by her husband in apartment 329. The Scariest Things Police Have Seen, Episode 55. This story is from a police officer in South Africa. He responded to an alarm call at a school with 2 of his partners. They searched the campus and found an open bathroom door. The door had a padlock on it that was open. It was the only locked bathroom on the campus. They all 3 walked in. Each had an uneasy feeling, but the bathroom was empty. They left, shut the door, and secured the padlock. As they were walking away, one officer realized he left his flashlight in the bathroom. They turned back to see if they could get inside to get it. They walked up to the door, and it flew open on its own. The padlock landed on the floor next to them. They decided the flashlight was not worth it and they left. The next morning, they talked to school officials about what happened and why the bathroom was locked. They said an 8-year-old girl died in that bathroom years before. Since her death, that door has been replaced several times because it opens and closes violently. The officer never found his flashlight. He did find small scratch marks on his leg that looked like they were caused by a child. The Scariest Things Police Have Seen, Part 40. I love paranormal stories from different cultures. This story was sent to me by the son of a police officer in Australia. The officer was on patrol with his partner, who was an Aboriginal elder. They were in the Northern Territory about 3 hours from civilization. When they stopped, the officer noticed on the side of a road a lot of footprints. The footprints looked like they belonged to children and led towards a mountain off in the distance. The officer asked his Aboriginal partner what he thought, and he said, "I have no clue." When they got back to the station, the the officer talked to his supervisor about what happened. The supervisor knew exactly what he was talking about. He spoke of a traditional indigenous story about tiny people who lived in the mountains who would come down and steal from locals. He also said the indigenous people were not allowed to talk about them, and his partner would deny what they saw. Sure enough, when the officer spoke to his partner again about what happened, the partner denied ever seeing footprints in the first place. The Scariest Things Police Have Seen, Part 41. This story was sent to me by a corrections officer in Arizona. He worked at a jail in Kingman, which has an old legend about a little girl which haunts its halls. Her name is Delilah. One night, this officer was working alone in a control room after the facility lockdown. While looking at the control panel, the officer saw in the corner of his eye what appeared to be someone's head and shoulders looking over the panel at him. He looked over the panel and saw nothing. About 30 minutes later, the officer felt something tug on the back of his uniform. He also heard a soft giggle. When he turned around, there was no one there. He told the corporal about what happened, and he responded, "Well, I guess Delilah likes you." The Scariest Things Police Have Seen, Part 42. This story was sent to me by a police officer in California who wished to be anonymous. On June 17th, 2002, an air tanker crashed near Walker, California, while on a firefighting mission. The crash was even caught on camera. An officer saw the crash and ran to it. While running through the forest, he came upon 3 men in flight suits who seemed dazed and confused. He asked them if they saw the crash, but they wouldn't respond to him. Since they weren't helpful, he continued on. When he got to the crash site, he found that all passengers on board were killed. There were 3 men on board that plane. The officer went back to where he saw the men in the forest, but he couldn't find them anywhere. No one else who responded to the crash site had seen them. The officer then realized that the 3 men he saw in the forest were the spirits of the crew members that died that day. The Scariest Things Police Have Seen, Part 43. This was sent to me by a police officer in Three Forks, Montana. In the town, there is a historic hotel built in 1882. Officers frequently respond for strange noise complaints. One evening, this officer responded there for a call about a suspicious person. A bartender said she was getting ready to close for the night when she heard something strange upstairs. She investigated, and in a storage space upstairs, she saw a man dressed in a white coat and wearing a chef's hat. She was terrified and called 911. When the officer responded, he too could hear noises coming from upstairs. He went to the storage space and saw the same man. The man ran into an adjacent room and the officer followed. When the officer turned the corner, the room was empty. There was no other way for the man to exit the room. The officer could tell that the boxes in the storage space had been moved because of lines left in the dust. Pretty freaky. The Scariest Things Police Have Seen, Part 45. This story was sent to me by a police officer in Cairo, Egypt. One night, this officer was stationed at a desert checkpoint. At the end of the shift, he left the checkpoint with his partners. They were about 150 kilometers away from the nearest city or town. In this area, it is common for drug dealers to hide just off the side of the road and signal to cars to buy drugs from them. While driving, the officers saw a man wearing a jalabia just standing off the side of the road. They stopped to investigate. The man ran up and over a sand berm and out of sight. The officers pursued and went over the sand berm about 4 seconds after the man. When they reached the top, they couldn't see him anywhere. What they did see, however, was what appeared to be a hairless dog running away from them on all fours. I've been getting a lot of stories about strange creatures lately. The Scariest Things Police Have Seen, Part 46. This was sent to me by a nephew of a trucker who had an encounter with a police officer. This trucker was driving on Highway 152 in California. He got pulled over by a highway patrol officer. It was odd though, because the police vehicle looked like an older 80s model unit. The officer gave him a ticket and left. Later on, the trucker went to the courthouse to fight the ticket. The judge looked at the ticket, got up and asked, "Do you think this is a joke?" The trucker said, "Why?" The judge told him that the officer's name and ID number used on the ticket belonged to an officer that had died on that freeway almost 40 years earlier. The Scariest Things Police Have Seen, Part 47. This story was sent to me by a police officer in Iowa who wished to be anonymous. Several years ago, a young woman went missing, and there were extensive searches for her body. This officer volunteered from out of the area to search for her. After spending the whole day searching, he and another officer went for a run. As they were cooling down after the jog, they heard a voice. It was someone asking for help. There was no yelling, and the voice remained calm. They shouted out for the individual and tried to look for who was speaking. They couldn't find anyone. Several days later, and after about a month of being missing, the woman's killer was found. He confessed to killing her weeks prior and led law enforcement to where he hid her body. The spot was within a half a mile of where the officers heard the voice asking for help. The Scariest Things Police Have Seen, Part 48. This story was sent to me by the son of a police officer in London. One night on patrol, he got a call about a car that had crashed in the middle of the forest. It ran off the road and off the edge of a bank. The officer arrived at the road where the call came out and got behind a van that was in front of him. He could see the emergency lights ahead of him from the emergency personnel who were already on scene. Suddenly, he heard a loud screech, and the van slid from the roadway down the bank and crashed into a tree. The police officer stopped to investigate. When he got out of his patrol vehicle, he heard a loud metallic scratching noise coming from the van. He ran down the bank to help the occupants of the vehicle, but couldn't find anyone inside. What he did find, however, was what appeared to be deep claw marks on the side of the van.